Camera 14 had been dead for 11 minutes, and Elena Marsh was the only person in the building who'd noticed. She sat at the night desk of the Hotel Fontaine, watching the security monitor where the East Wing corridor should have been glowing gray and empty. Instead there was static, then black, then nothing at all, a hole in the hotel's memory, right outside the private conference suite that had been booked in cash, under a name she didn't recognize. She pulled the maintenance log without thinking twice. 8 years on this desk had taught her that hotels don't lie by accident. They lie in work orders, in timestamps, in names typed by people who assume no one reads carefully. The ticket for Camera 14 had been filed at 9:52 that evening. Routine recalibration, it said. Approved by facilities. Elena had processed every facilities request that came through this hotel for 3 years. She knew every technician's badge number by heart. The name on this one, R. Doyle, belonged to no one on the current roster, no one on the old one, no one at all. She printed it anyway because printing things felt like doing something, and because outside, past the tall glass doors, headlights were sweeping into the porte-cochere. A black sedan slowed to a stop. Then another behind it. She knew the car. Everyone on nights knew that car. Roman Castellano didn't visit often, but when he did, the whole hotel seemed to hold its breath a little differently. Not from fear exactly, though there was some of that too, but from the particular attention powerful men attract without asking for it. He tipped the valets more than they made in a week. He remembered the housekeeping staff's names. He also, everyone understood without being told, was not a man whose enemies announced themselves politely. Elena's eyes went back to the dead monitor, then to the blank corridor it should have shown, then to the door of the suite where, in 11 minutes, he would be sitting with his back half-turned to a hallway no camera in the building could see. She thought about her manager, who hated anything that slowed the guest experience. She thought about her brother's tuition, due in 6 days. She thought about the fact that whoever had filed that ticket had known exactly which camera mattered, and exactly when to kill it. The front doors opened. Cold air moved through the lobby. Roman Castellano walked in, unhurried, unaware, already reaching to shake the hand of a man Elena had never seen before. She was still holding the printed work order when he crossed the threshold. Elena had worked the overnight desk at the Fontaine since she was 22. Back when the hotel still had a fax machine nobody trusted, and a manager who called her the new girl for 2 straight years. She wasn't new anymore. She was the person other clerks called when a reservation didn't make sense, when a bill didn't add up, when a guest complained about a charge that turned out, 9 times out of 10, to be exactly correct. It wasn't a glamorous kind of expertise. Nobody wrote songs about night auditors. But Elena had learned, slowly and without meaning to, that a hotel's paperwork told the truth even when its guests didn't. Work orders had timestamps. Deliveries had signatures. Cameras had maintenance schedules that, if you paid attention, told you who had walked through a hallway and who had made very sure no one would ever know. She lived 20 minutes from the hotel with her younger brother, Sam, who was 2 years into a machinist apprenticeship that cost more than either of them liked to say out loud. Their parents were gone. A car accident when Elena was 19, Sam barely 14, and she'd spent the years since making sure he never had to feel the ground shift under him the way it had shifted under her. The night shift paid better. The night shift was quiet enough to study invoices instead of just stamping them. The night shift, more than anything, was hers to keep. She could not afford to be wrong about a dead security camera. She also, and this was the part that kept her standing in the lobby instead of walking away, could not afford to be right and do nothing. Roman Castellano wasn't a stranger to the Fontaine. He came in every few months, always the same suite, always paying in a way that made the accounting department sigh with relief. He was courteous in the specific way of men who had been taught manners as armor. He asked the valet about his knee surgery. He tipped the overnight bellhop enough to cover a car payment, and he had once, without any fanfare, quietly settled a family's incidentals bill after their card was declined at the front desk. Elena had clocked all of that the way she clocked everything. Filed, cross-referenced, unremarked upon. She also knew, because the hotel staff always knew things they weren't supposed to, that he'd once been engaged. Vivian Ashworth used to call the concierge desk personally to arrange flowers, private dinners, Small theatrical surprises for a man who, by every account Elena had overheard, had genuinely loved her. The engagement had ended abruptly 2 years ago. No scandal in the press, no scene in the lobby. Just a sudden and total silence where Vivian's name used to be. Elena hadn't thought about her in months. Until tonight, when the fraudulent work order for camera 14 listed a callback number that, out of habit more than suspicion, Elena ran through the hotel's old vendor directory, and found it partially matched a number Vivian's assistant had used years ago to confirm flower deliveries. It wasn't proof. Elena knew the difference between a coincidence and a case, and this was still closer to the former. But it was enough to make her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with her paycheck. Marcus, Roman's head of security, was already moving through the lobby toward the elevators, scanning the room the way he always did, missing, because he had no reason to look, the exact thing Elena had spent the last 10 minutes staring at. She thought about the easy version of tonight. Log the outage. Note it for the morning shift. Let facilities handle it tomorrow, when everyone was awake and the stakes were paperwork instead of people. It was technically all her job required. But she'd also learned something else in 8 years behind this desk. The difference between a hotel running smoothly and a hotel where something terrible almost happened was very rarely luck. It was very often one person who noticed something small and refused to let it go. There was a version of tonight, too, where she was simply wrong, where the mismatched phone number was nothing more than an old vendor's recycled digits, where the missing technician was a subcontractor who'd never bothered registering, where she embarrassed herself in front of a man whose good opinion could quietly end her career at the Fontaine with a single phone call to Priya. Elena had turned that possibility over more than once in the 90 seconds it took her to cross the lobby, and she hadn't found an answer that made the risk feel smaller. She'd only found the older, steadier fact underneath it, that she had spent 8 years training herself to trust what the paperwork said over what convenience wanted her to believe, and she wasn't going to abandon that training now because the stakes had suddenly grown teeth. She thought, briefly and without meaning to, of her father, not because he had anything to do with hotels or cameras, but because he'd been the kind of man who stopped his car on the highway once to help a stranded driver he'd never met, ignoring her mother's insistence that it wasn't their problem. Somebody has to be the one who stops, he used to say. And Elena had spent a decade wishing she'd asked him what that cost him, before there wasn't time left to ask. She folded the printed work order once, tucked it into her blazer pocket instead of the file drawer where it belonged, and stepped out from behind the desk before she could talk herself out of it. "Mr. Castellano." Elena caught up to him just short of the elevator bank, her voice pitched low enough not to carry to the 2 men flanking him. "Do you have a moment before you go up?" He turned. Up close, he was younger than the way people talked about him suggested. Mid-30s, dark eyes that assessed rather than stared, a stillness to him that felt deliberate, like a man who had learned early that sudden movements got noticed. "Elena," he said, and she was startled that he remembered her name. "Everything all right? I need to show you something. It'll take 30 seconds. Marcus stepped in before Roman could answer. "Whatever it is, route it through me." "I tried," Elena said, which was a small lie, softened only by the fact that she genuinely believed Marcus would have waved it off. "This can't wait for the morning shift log." Roman held up a hand, and Marcus, visibly unhappy, stopped talking. 30 seconds, Roman said. She pulled the folded work order from her pocket and held it out instead of just describing it. She'd learned that too, over the years, that people believed paper faster than they believed voices. Camera 14, in the east corridor outside the suite you're booked in tonight, went dark at 9:52. The work order says routine recalibration, approved by facilities. I process every facilities request that comes through this building. I don't know the technician who supposedly filed this. He doesn't exist in our system. Marcus took the paper before Roman could, scanning it with the flat expression of a man already composing his rebuttal. Hotels screw up paperwork constantly, he said. Half your vendors don't even use real names on invoices to dodge taxes. That's true, Elena said, because it was, and because conceding a fair point felt more persuasive than fighting one. But the callback number on this ticket isn't a vendor's. It's close, not exact but close, to a number that used to call this desk to arrange deliveries for Ms. Ashworth. The name landed in the small space between them like something dropped from a height. Roman's expression didn't change dramatically. He wasn't a man who let his face do his talking, but something in his stillness sharpened. "Vivian," he said flat, testing the shape of it. "I could be wrong," Elena said honestly. "It's a partial match, not a confirmation. But someone disabled the one camera covering the hallway outside your suite, 11 minutes before you arrived, and used a name that isn't real to do it. I didn't think that was something to log for tomorrow." Marcus's jaw tightened. This is exactly the kind of amateur panic that gets people hurt. "We have protocols." "Marcus." Roman's voice wasn't loud, but it ended the sentence anyway. He looked at Elena for a long moment, the kind of look that felt like being weighed. "Why would you bring this to me yourself instead of just quietly telling my security?" It was a fair question, and Elena gave him the honest answer instead of a diplomatic one. "Because I did tell hotel security an hour into my shift when I first saw the outage flagged, and nothing happened. And because you employ people whose job is to make problems disappear quietly, and I wasn't sure quiet was the right response to this one." Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across his face and was gone. "You work the desk downstairs. 8 years. You could lose that job for stepping outside your role like this." "I know," Elena said. "I decided that was still better than being the person who watched a camera get disabled and said nothing." Roman looked at Marcus, who was still holding the printed ticket like it personally offended him, then back at Elena. Around them, the lobby moved on obliviously. A bellhop wheeling luggage, a couple checking in, the low hum of a hotel that had no idea anything unusual was happening 20 feet away. "2 things," Roman said finally. "First, I'm not going up to that suite through the east corridor. We'll take the service elevator and Marcus, get someone to physically walk that hallway before anyone else does." Marcus opened his mouth to object and then, reading something in Roman's face, didn't. "Second," Roman turned back to Elena. "Walk with me. Not into the suite. Just to the elevator. I want 5 more minutes of whatever instinct made you cross this lobby instead of letting me walk into a blind hallway." It wasn't a request exactly, though he'd phrased it as one. Elena understood with a small cold clarity that she had just made a choice with no clean way to undo it. She could still, technically, turn back, apologize, say she'd overstepped, let Marcus reroute the whole conversation into something the hotel's insurance policy would approve of. Instead she fell into step beside him, and felt the shape of the night rearrange itself around a version of the evening she had not clocked in expecting to live. They didn't speak again until they reached the service elevator, Marcus trailing a few steps behind with the printed work order still folded in his hand like evidence he hadn't decided whether to believe. The corridor back here was narrower, lined with laundry carts and the low hum of industrial refrigeration, nothing like the marble hush of the lobby. Roman glanced at the ceiling once, at the small camera bolted above the loading door, and Elena understood without being told that he was checking whether that one, too, was working. "You said 8 years," he said, as the elevator doors closed. "Doing what exactly all that time?" "Auditing," Elena said. "Making sure the hotel's version of a night matches what actually happened in it. And tonight's version doesn't match." "No," she said. "Tonight's version has a hole in it exactly the size of your suite door, and somebody cut that hole on purpose." He didn't answer right away. The elevator climbed in silence, and Elena found herself aware, in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be in the lobby, of how much smaller this space was, how close he was standing, how little either of them actually knew about what the next hour would ask of them. By 1 in the morning, Elena's manager Priya had called her into the back office twice, once to ask tightly why hotel security had reported unauthorized clerk involvement in a guest matter, and once to remind her more tightly that the Fontaine's policy on high-profile guests was observe, accommodate, and never, under any circumstance, editorialize. "I found a fraudulent work order," Elena said for the second time. "I didn't editorialize. I did my job. Your job is the front desk, not investigations." Priya rubbed her eyes. It was clear she'd been pulled out of bed for this. "Marcus is furious. He's saying you inserted yourself into a security matter that could put the hotel's contract with the Castellano family at risk. Or it could save someone's life, Elena said. I'm not sure which version of that story Marcus is worried about more. Priya didn't have an answer for that, which told Elena more than anything else could have. She went back to her desk with the uncomfortable, familiar feeling of having done the right thing and made everything harder anyway. Marcus's men had walked the east corridor and found nothing. No wire, no ambush, no obvious threat, which had let him dismiss the whole incident as an overreacting clerk chasing a paperwork error. Elena didn't fully believe that, and she suspected, from the careful way Roman had thanked her before disappearing into the service elevator, that he didn't either. It was Theo, the overnight bellhop, who gave her the second piece. "You still worried about that camera thing?" he asked, leaning on the desk around 2, in the lull between late check-ins. "More than Marcus wants me to be." Theo glanced toward the back office, then lowered his voice. "I saw a woman near the service corridor about an hour before Mr. Castellano got here. Dark coat, moved like she knew the building. I didn't think anything of it. Guests wander sometimes, but she went into the electrical closet by the loading dock. That's not a guest thing to do. Did you see her face?" "Not clearly. But she had this, this way of walking like she owned wherever she was standing. I've seen her before, actually. A couple years back she used to come through here a lot. Always dressed sharp. Always asking the concierge for something specific." Elena's pulse ticked up. "Do you remember a name?" "No. But I remember she once made a florist redo an entire arrangement because the roses were the wrong shade of white. That's not the kind of thing you forget." It wasn't proof. Elena knew that. But it was a second thread pulling in the same direction as the first, and threads that pulled together long enough eventually became rope. She went back into the maintenance archive, the real one, not the one Marcus's team had access to, the internal ledger that tracked every service ticket filed at the Fontaine for the past 3 years, the kind of database nobody thought to check because nobody thought a clerk would bother. It took 40 minutes of careful searching before she found it. A nearly identical work order, filed 11 months earlier, disabling the same camera, the same corridor, the same fabricated technician name, on a night when hotel records showed Vivian Ashworth had booked a private dinner 2 floors below. Elena sat very still for a moment, staring at the screen. This wasn't a single reactive act of sabotage tonight. This was a pattern. A method someone had used before successfully without anyone noticing because nobody had been looking. Whatever tonight was building toward, it wasn't improvised. She printed both tickets side by side and carried them upstairs to the service floor where Roman had asked to be reached if anything developed. Marcus intercepted her at the elevator, arms crossed, clearly having decided somewhere in the last hour that Elena Marsh was a problem he intended to solve by removing her from the equation. "I already told Priya. This ends now," he said. "You're not hotel security. You're not family. You brought us a coincidence, and now you're digging through internal records you have no business accessing." "There's a second ticket," Elena said, holding it up instead of arguing. "Same camera, same fake name, filed 11 months ago. The same night Vivian Ashworth had a private dinner in this building. That's not a coincidence. That's a method." Marcus's expression flickered. Not disbelief exactly, but the specific discomfort of a professional realizing he'd missed something a clerk hadn't. "Give me that." "I'll give it to him," Elena said, nodding toward the suite door behind Marcus. "Not because I don't trust you to pass it along. Because I watched what happened the first time information about tonight went through someone other than him." For a moment she thought Marcus might physically block the door. Instead, after a long beat, he stepped aside, not gracefully, but decisively enough that Elena understood the balance of the night had shifted. Roman was standing by the window when she came in, jacket off, tie loosened, looking less like the composed man from the lobby and more like someone doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. He took the 2 tickets from her without a word and read them both twice. 11 months ago, he said finally, was the night her father died. The room went very quiet. "I was told it was ruled a suicide," Roman said, more to himself than to her. "I was told there was nothing more to it. I never once thought to check whether anyone had disabled a camera in this building that same night. He looked up at Elena, and for the first time since she'd met him hours earlier, he looked less like a man in control of a room and more like a man realizing how much he hadn't controlled at all. I think, he said slowly, we need to have a very different conversation with Vivian than the one I assumed we'd be having tonight. Marcus, still standing near the door, seemed to age 5 years in the space of that sentence. If her father's death 11 months ago is connected to tonight, he said, that's not a hotel security issue anymore. That's a family issue, and family issues in this family don't usually get handled with paperwork and a clerk's instincts. I know exactly how my family usually handles things, Roman said, an edge entering his voice that hadn't been there before. That's precisely why I'm not doing it that way this time. I've spent 2 years assuming the story I was told about that night was complete because nobody around me had a reason to lie to me about it. I'm done assuming that. He looked at Elena. You said there might be a second question underneath this. Who benefits from that camera going dark twice, 11 months apart? I want to know the answer before I walk into any room with Vivian pretending I don't. Elena nodded, already turning the pieces over in her mind. The timing, the method, the fact that whoever had arranged tonight's outage had clearly known the same technician trick had worked once before without consequence. Patterns like that didn't come from panic. They came from someone who had done this kind of quiet, careful work long enough to trust it. Then we need Corbin, she said. Whoever filed both tickets used the same falsified name and the same cash arrangement. Someone close to Vivian handled the logistics both times. If we find him before Marcus's people spook him into disappearing, he might tell us more than either ticket ever could. Vivian's assistant, a nervous young man named Corbin, was easier to find than Elena expected. He'd been staying at a boutique property 4 blocks away under his own name, careless in the specific way of people who'd never expected to be looked for. Roman brought him to a private room off the hotel's business center. No threats, no theater, just 2 chairs, a closed door, and the particular quiet authority of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to make people talk. Corbin talked fast, the way people do when they've been carrying something heavy alone for a long time. He hadn't hired the technician who disabled the cameras. He'd only passed along a name and a cash payment, both provided by Vivian, with instructions not to ask questions. He'd assumed, he said, that it was about privacy. Surprise. Something sentimental, given the history between her and Roman. He hadn't let himself think harder than that, because thinking harder would have meant admitting what it might actually be. 11 months ago, Roman said. The same arrangement. What was that one for? Corbin's hands were shaking slightly. I wasn't working for her yet back then. I only know what she told me once, when she'd had too much wine. That there was a meeting that night. Her father and... He hesitated, glancing at Roman like the next words might cost him something. Your cousin. Nico. Roman went very still. Elena, standing near the door, watched something complicated move across his face. Not shock exactly, more like a man recalculating a math problem he'd been certain he'd already solved. My cousin was in Europe 11 months ago, he said, but the certainty in his voice had thinned. I don't know the details, Corbin said quickly. I only know she believes your family destroyed him. That the suicide ruling was a story your people paid for. That her father tried to warn someone about a deal that put your family's name on something illegal, and it got him killed and covered up. He looked between them. I know how it sounds. I told her I thought she was wrong. She didn't want to hear it. Roman didn't say anything for a long moment. When he finally spoke, it wasn't to Corbin. Nico came back from Europe 2 days early that trip, he said quietly, almost to himself. I remember because he missed my father's birthday dinner and made excuses for it for weeks. Elena watched him absorb it. Not just the possibility that his family's official story about a man's death was wrong, but the sharper, more personal cut underneath it. That he had trusted the version of events he'd been given without ever once questioning who benefited from him not looking closer. It was, she realized, exactly the flaw she'd sensed in him from the lobby. Not cruelty, not carelessness, but a deep and costly habit of believing the people closest to him simply because they were close. I need to talk to Vivian directly, Roman said. Tonight. Not through Marcus, not through a lawyer. Just her and me, with proof in the room instead of just accusations. That's dangerous, Elena said. If she's the one behind 2 sabotaged cameras and she thinks she's cornered. I know. He looked at her, and something in his expression had shifted from the composed courtesy of the lobby into something raw. I'm not going to pretend I have a clean way through this. But I'm done letting people manage me into not seeing things clearly. You didn't have to bring me that first ticket. You definitely didn't have to bring me the second one after Marcus told you to stop. I'm not going to repay that by handling the rest of tonight the way my family handled the last 11 months. Quietly and wrong. It wasn't a declaration of anything beyond exactly what he said, but Elena felt it land somewhere she hadn't expected a hotel guest's words to reach. She pushed past the feeling because there wasn't room for it yet. If we're doing this, she said, we do it in a way that doesn't rely on threats and doesn't rely on your family quietly making a second death disappear the way they made the first ruling stick. If Vivian's father really was killed and covered up, that needs proof that survives outside this building. Not just your word. Roman studied her for a moment, and something that looked almost like respect settled into his expression. You don't trust me to handle this fairly. I don't know you well enough yet to trust that, Elena said honestly. I trust that you want to. That's not the same thing. He almost smiled despite everything. Fair. They spent the next hour building something closer to a plan than the frantic instinct that had carried the night so far. Elena pulling records, Roman making calls he clearly hated making, both of them working around the edges of a truth neither fully had yet. Somewhere in the middle of it, Elena realized she'd stopped thinking about her job, about Priya's warnings, about the version of tonight where she quietly logged an outage and went home at dawn to make her brother breakfast. That version of the night was gone. What replaced it was riskier, murkier, and, she admitted to herself in the one honest moment she allowed, more alive than 8 years behind a hotel desk had ever felt. But risk didn't care how alive it felt. Somewhere in this building, a woman who had already arranged one death was likely realizing that her second attempt at controlling the narrative was falling apart in real time. And cornered people, Elena knew from nothing but instinct, and every hotel emergency she'd ever managed, rarely responded to that realization quietly. Before they left the business center, Roman stopped her at the door, his hand not quite touching her arm. I need to say something, and I need you to hear it as more than politeness, he said. Whatever happens with Vivian tonight, I'm not going to let this cost you your job. If Priya or corporate tries to make an example out of you for stepping outside protocol, that stops with me. I didn't do this for protection, Elena said, more sharply than she intended. I did it because it was true, and because I couldn't make myself unsee it. I know, he said. That's exactly why I'm offering it anyway. People who do the right thing because it's true, and not because they expect anything for it, are the ones who usually end up paying for it the most. I've watched that happen more times than I'd like to admit, and I'm not interested in watching it happen to you. It wasn't romance, not yet, not exactly, but it was the first moment all night where Elena felt something in her chest shift that had nothing to do with cameras or evidence or the careful architecture of proof they were building. She filed the feeling away the same way she filed everything else that didn't fit into the immediate crisis. Carefully, and for later. Down the hall, Corbin sat alone where they'd left him, shoulders curled forward, staring at his own phone like it had betrayed him simply by existing. Whatever came next, Elena understood, would not be the last hard conversation of the night, only the next one in a line that was only getting longer. Elena spent the walk back turning over the shape of what they actually had, and what they still lacked. A recollection from a nervous assistant wasn't evidence, not in any form that would survive daylight or a lawyer's scrutiny. A cousin's early return from Europe wasn't proof of anything beyond an inconvenient coincidence, easily explained away by a dozen ordinary reasons if no one pushed harder. What they needed wasn't a story that made sense to people already inclined to believe it. They needed something that made sense to people who weren't. You're doing the math, Roman said, watching her. I'm doing the math, she agreed. Right now we have a theory. Theories don't hold up in rooms where people have every reason to want them to fail. So what do we need? Something that isn't a memory and isn't a guess. Something with a timestamp attached to it that nobody in this building can argue with. She thought of the old server humming quietly behind the laundry room, the one she'd once filed decommissioning paperwork for and watched disappear into a drawer, unread. I think I know where to start looking. The Fontaine had a backup server that almost no one remembered existed, installed 6 years earlier during a security overhaul, quietly abandoned when the newer system replaced it, still humming away in a closet behind the laundry room because nobody had ever filed the paperwork to decommission it. Elena knew about it only because she'd been the one to file the very paperwork that got ignored. It still mirrored select camera feeds, including, as it turned out, a partial backup of camera 14 from 11 months earlier. Grainy, low resolution, but enough. Enough to show a figure matching Vivian's build entering the electrical closet 40 minutes before the camera went dark. And enough, more importantly, to show her leaving 15 minutes after her father's recorded time of death, several floors above where his body was later found. This isn't proof of murder, Elena said carefully, watching Roman study the frozen frame. It's proof she was in this building, near that camera, around the time it matters. That's a thread. It's not the rope yet. It's more than we had an hour ago, Roman said. The rope came from an unexpected direction. Theo, the bellhop, agreed, after Elena explained honestly what it might cost him, to state on record what he'd seen tonight. Vivian near the service corridor, the electrical closet, the timing that lined up with the second fake work order. He was nervous about it, and Elena didn't blame him. Testifying against a woman connected to a family like the Castellanos wasn't a small thing to ask of someone making $18 an hour. "Why are you doing this?" she asked him quietly before they went further. Theo shrugged, embarrassed by his own honesty. "Because you didn't have to ask me twice. You could have just used what I told you earlier without checking if I was okay putting my name on it. Feels like the least I can do is actually mean it." It struck Elena, standing in the quiet service corridor at 3 in the morning, that the entire night had turned into a small, unglamorous chain of people choosing to tell the truth even when it cost them something. Theo risking his job, Corbin risking Vivian's fury, herself risking 8 years of quiet competence for a hunch about a dead camera. None of it was cinematic. All of it mattered. The final piece came almost by accident. Corbin, shaken and increasingly desperate to distance himself from what he'd helped set in motion, handed over his phone without being asked. An old voice message from Vivian, sent the week before, her voice clipped and precise. Instructions about the technician, the payment, the specific camera number, and one line that made the whole night snap into focus. "Just make sure it's dark before he walks that hallway." I'm not asking twice. It wasn't a confession to murder. But it was Vivian's own voice, tying her directly to tonight's sabotage in a way no falsified work order alone ever could. While Elena assembled the pieces, Vivian herself was not idle. Priya called Elena into the office a third time near 4 in the morning, visibly rattled. "Corporate just called. Someone's requesting you be pulled from the desk immediately. Reassigned, effective tonight, some complaint about clerk misconduct with a guest." It came through channels I've never seen move that fast. Elena understood immediately who had made that call, and what it meant. Vivian knew, or at least suspected, that she was being cornered, and was trying to remove the one person who'd been quietly assembling the case against her before it finished coming together. "I need 2 more hours, Elena said. "After that, reassign me wherever you want." Priya hesitated, caught, Elena could see, between policy and something that looked almost like respect. 2 hours, she said finally. "I don't know what you're doing, but Marcus came by 15 minutes ago and didn't look like a man dismissing a paperwork error anymore." Roman, for his part, kept the promise Elena hadn't fully realized she'd needed him to make. When Marcus suggested, not for the first time, that the cleanest solution was to simply have Vivian quietly removed from the building and handled through channels that never touched daylight, Roman shut it down flatly. "No. Whatever happened to her father, whatever she believes about my family, this gets handled where people can see it. I'm not repeating the mistake that put us here." It cost him something to say it. Elena could see that in the tightness around his eyes, the particular restraint of a man whose instincts, and whose family's whole operating logic, ran toward quiet control rather than open reckoning. But he held the line. By 5 in the morning they had what they needed. 2 falsified work orders 11 months apart, backup footage placing Vivian near the disabled camera the night her father died, Theo's witnessed account of her presence tonight, and her own recorded voice authorizing the sabotage. 4 pieces. Nothing extra, nothing padded. Just enough that denial would require lying to evidence instead of merely to people. There was a moment, just before 5, when Elena caught Roman standing alone by the archive terminal, watching the 11-month-old footage loop on mute, the figure entering the electrical closet, the long stretch of nothing, the same figure leaving. He didn't notice her at first. "You don't have to watch it again," she said quietly. "I keep thinking I'll see something different the 4th time," he said without turning around. "Some detail that changes what it means. It never does." He finally looked at her. "My family has a talent for turning inconvenient truths into private matters. I used to think that was loyalty. Tonight I'm starting to think it's just cowardice with better tailoring." "You didn't build that habit," Elena said. "You inherited it. What you do with it now is the only part that's actually yours." He studied her for a moment in the low light of the archive room, and something in his expression settled, like a decision quietly finishing itself. Marcus wants this handled his way. Quiet room, quiet resolution. Vivian gone by morning and no one outside this hotel ever hearing her name again. "And you. I want it handled where it can't be buried a second time." He straightened, rolling his shoulders back like a man preparing for something physical instead of a conversation. Whatever she meant to do tonight, she's about to find out the room she's walking into isn't the one she planned for. Elena checked the folder one final time before they moved toward the conference suite. The 2 work orders side by side, the archived footage saved in triplicate now across 3 different drives so no single point of failure could make it disappear again. Theo's brief written statement and Corbin's phone, its recording backed up to Elena's own hotel email account out of an instinct she couldn't fully explain except that she'd learned, over 8 years, never to let the only copy of anything important live in the hands of someone who might change his mind. "If she denies it outright," Elena said, "we don't argue with her. We just play the recording once and let it sit in the room. People rarely keep arguing with their own voice." Roman nodded slowly, and for the first time since the black car had pulled into the porte cochere hours earlier, Elena saw something in his face that looked less like the composed authority of a man used to being obeyed, and more like simple gratitude for not having to walk into that room alone. Vivian, unaware how much had already been assembled against her, walked into the East Conference Suite at 5:15 believing she was arriving for the quiet, private reconciliation she'd spent weeks engineering. One more controlled room, one more version of events she expected to shape from the inside. She stopped just inside the doorway when she saw who else was in the room. Roman standing by the window. Marcus near the door, arms crossed. Corbin, pale and unable to meet her eyes. And Elena, seated at the small conference table with a folder in front of her that Vivian clearly hadn't expected to see. "What is this?" Vivian said. Not a question. A demand dressed as one. "Sit down," Roman said. Not unkindly but not gently either. "I don't answer to hotel staff," Vivian said, glancing at Elena with a coolness that had clearly worked on plenty of people before tonight. "And I don't know what story you've been sold, Roman, but—" "Camera 14, Elena said, cutting through it, "was disabled tonight at 9:52, using a falsified work order under a technician name that doesn't exist. The same camera, using the same fabricated name, was disabled 11 months ago, the night your father died in this building." The room went utterly still. Vivian's composure didn't break exactly, but something underneath it visibly recalculated. "That's a coincidence dressed up as an accusation." "It would be," Elena said, "if it weren't also on your voice." She turned her laptop around, and Corbin flinched as his own phone's recording played, Vivian's voice unmistakable in the quiet room. "Just make sure it's dark before he walks that hallway. I'm not asking twice." Vivian's eyes went to Corbin with a fury that made him shrink physically smaller. "You gave them that." "I didn't have to be asked twice either in the end," Corbin said quietly. "I'm sorry. I should have asked more questions 11 months ago. I'm not making that mistake again." For a moment, Vivian looked at the room like she was calculating exits. Legal, verbal, physical, and found none of them clean. When she spoke again, the polish had cracked entirely, and what came through underneath it was raw in a way Elena hadn't expected and, despite everything, felt the weight of. "Your family killed my father," Vivian said, looking only at Roman now. He found out about the shipment routing through Castellano accounts that should never have touched anything legitimate, and he tried to warn someone outside the family. And 3 weeks later he was dead in this hotel, and your people called it a suicide before his body was even cold. "I loved you. I was going to marry you. And I watched your family close ranks around a lie so fast I understood, finally, exactly what kind of family I was marrying into." Roman didn't flinch away from it, though Elena could see what it cost him to hold still. "I believed the suicide ruling," he said. "I'm not going to stand here and pretend that's an excuse. I should have asked harder questions. I trusted people close to me instead of the truth. And that trust cost your father the version of justice he deserved." He paused. But Vivian, disabling that camera again tonight wasn't about proving what happened to him. It was about erasing whatever's on that old footage before anyone else could find it. "That's not grief. That's the same cover-up you say you hate, done by your own hand instead of mine." "I wanted proof," Vivian said, but it came out smaller than her earlier fury. "I wanted to know before I did anything else whether it was really Nico in that footage, whether it was really an accident during a robbery he arranged, the way Corbin told me once he'd heard, or whether it was something worse. I needed to see it before your family destroyed it the way they destroyed the truth the first time." Elena watched Roman absorb that. Not an assassin's motive after all, but something closer to a wound that had curdled into something it never should have become, still shaped, underneath all the sabotage, by grief rather than pure calculation. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it explained it, and Elena had learned enough tonight to know those were two different things. Marcus shifted near the door, clearly uncomfortable with how far this had already strayed from the quiet resolution he'd argued for. "Roman, whatever you decide to do with this, I'd ask you to think about what happens once it's outside this room. Nico is family. This footage, if it goes further than the four of us, doesn't just damage him. It damages everything your father built. My father built plenty of things I'm no longer certain I want to defend without looking at them first," Roman said, not unkindly, but without room for argument either. "I'm not asking your permission, Marcus. I'm telling you where this is going." Vivian's eyes moved between them, some of the fury draining into something more uncertain, as if she hadn't expected to watch Roman turn that same unflinching attention on his own family instead of only on her. "You're actually going to look at it," she said slowly. "Not bury it. Not manage it into something smaller. I've spent 2 years believing a version of events that let me stay comfortable," Roman said. "I'm done doing that at your expense or Nico's or anyone else's. If the footage shows something I don't want to see, I'll still look at it. That's the least I owe your father, and honestly, the least I owe myself." "Then let's actually look at it," Roman said. "Together. Right now in this room, with witnesses who aren't just my family's people." He looked at Elena. "The backup footage." Elena pulled it up, and the room watched in silence as the grainy recording played. A struggle in the electrical closet, 2 men, a shipment case, a shove that sent Vivian's father backward into a metal shelving unit hard enough to be fatal. Not an execution. An accident during what looked, unmistakably, like a robbery gone wrong. Nico's face visible for just a moment before the footage cut, panic rather than calculation written across it. "He was trying to steal from us," Roman said quietly, piecing it together in real time. "Not warn anyone. He must have found the routing information and tried to use it. Leverage or theft, I don't know which yet. Nico caught him in the act, and it went wrong. And rather than admit any of that, my family buried the truth under a suicide ruling because the real story was almost as embarrassing as murder would have been." Vivian's hands were shaking. "That's not what It's not the story you were told, and it's not the story I was told either," Roman said. "But it's the truth, and you deserve to have had it 11 months ago instead of finding it through cameras you disabled twice, endangering people who had nothing to do with any of this." He looked at her for a long moment, something that had once clearly been real tenderness still visible underneath the exhaustion. I'm not going to protect Nico from what this footage shows. I'm done protecting my family's comfort instead of the truth. But Vivian, you don't get to decide that justice for your father is worth risking Elena's job, Theo's safety, or my life on the chance you were right. You should have come to me. Not around me. Vivian sank into the nearest chair, the fight finally leaving her posture, replaced by something closer to exhaustion. What happens now, she said. Not defiant this time. Just tired. Now you tell the truth fully to whoever ends up investigating this formally, Roman said. And you accept whatever accountability comes from disabling that camera tonight. Not as punishment for your father's death, because that's not what this is, but because 2 people in this building could have been hurt by what you set in motion. That's real, whatever your reasons were. And your family? Vivian asked. Nico doesn't get protected the way my father protected him the first time, Roman said. I can't undo what happened 11 months ago. I can stop pretending it didn't. Marcus said nothing further. Elena watched him instead, the particular stillness of a man recalculating, for the second time that night, exactly what kind of boss he actually worked for. Whatever version of Roman Castellano he'd built his loyalty around, it had just shifted underneath him, and from the look on his face, he hadn't yet decided whether that was a loss or a relief. The silence that followed held its own kind of verdict. By the time the sun came up over the fontaine's east wing, the shape of the night had settled into something quieter and more permanent. Nico was removed from any operational role in the family's business within the week, not executed, not disappeared, but formally and publicly cut out. His access revoked. His name attached to a robbery-turned-fatal accident that Roman insisted be reported honestly to the small circle of people who'd trusted the original cover story. Cost the Castellano name real damage. Roman let it cost that, rather than let it cost anyone else the truth a second time. Vivian faced consequences too, though not the ones she might have once feared from a family like Roman's. No violence, no quiet disappearance. Instead, restitution. A formal, documented account of what had actually happened to her father, delivered to her not as a favor but as an obligation Roman's family had owed her for nearly a year. Legal consequences for the sabotage followed as well, negotiated rather than buried, a path that held her accountable without pretending her grief had come from nowhere. She left the world she and Roman had once shared entirely, but she left it, for the first time in 11 months, without a lie sitting underneath everything she thought she knew. The Fontaine changed too in smaller ways. Elena wrote a new verification policy for maintenance requests. No work order affecting security systems could be approved without a second, independent confirmation call to the vendor directly, a rule that would have caught both falsified tickets in seconds if it had existed a year earlier. Priya, to her credit, championed it through corporate without hesitation once she understood what it might have prevented. Theo got a formal commendation, and a raise he badly needed, for what his manager's report carefully described as exceptional attentiveness, which made him laugh for the first time in days when he read it. Elena kept her job. More than that, she kept something she hadn't expected to gain from a single overnight shift, a kind of standing she'd never had before, not loud, not dramatic, just the quiet certainty of colleagues who now understood exactly what she was capable of noticing. She and Roman didn't rush anything which felt, to Elena, like its own kind of proof. He came back to the Fontaine 3 weeks later, not for business, and asked if she'd have coffee with him in the small cafe off the lobby where neither of them had to perform anything for anyone watching. It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't even, that first time, entirely clear what it was. It was 2 people who had spent one impossible night being honest with each other under real pressure, curious whether that honesty could survive ordinary daylight too. Elena found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she wanted to find out. What stayed with her longest wasn't the danger, or even the vindication of being right about a dead camera. It was the small, unglamorous choice that had started everything. The decision, made alone at a desk at midnight, to fold a piece of paper into her pocket instead of a filing drawer, because doing something felt more honest than doing nothing. Roman had trusted the people closest to him for years without questioning whether that trust was still earned. Vivian had let grief convince her that secrecy was the same thing as justice. Both of them, in their own ways, had mistaken control for safety, and both had learned, at real cost, that the truth handled openly is almost always safer than the truth managed quietly by people who think they know best. So here's the question worth sitting with. If you notice something small and wrong, a camera that shouldn't be dark, a name that didn't belong on a form, would you have folded that paper into your pocket too, knowing it might cost you everything you'd built? Or would you have let it go, and told yourself it wasn't your job to notice? If this story stayed with you, tell me which choice you would have made. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this one.